I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he may die, shall live. What if I told you that before the resurrection of Lazarus, before that impressive scene in which Jesus called a dead man out of the tomb, there was another similar miracle, but that almost no one knows about? A story forgotten by time, hidden in the shadows of history, but which today will be revealed here in the unknown stories of Jesus. Many know the miracles of Jesus. He healed the blind, made the paralyzed walk, multiplied bread and fish to feed hungry multitudes. But what about those miracles that almost no one has heard about? Those that happened far from the crowds, without the scribes recording them with the same intensity? Have you ever stopped to think about how many incredible stories have been lost to time? Well, this is one of them. And this isn't just any story. It is an event that can change your way of seeing life, faith, and even death. If Jesus was able to bring a young man back to life even before Lazarus, what does that mean for us today? Just imagine a young man presumed dead, his family crying around him, convinced that nothing more could be done. The lament echoing through the streets of a small village as preparations for the burial began. Everyone was sure there was no going back. But then Jesus appeared, and something unbelievable happened. Now I ask you, do you believe in miracles? Not those distant miracles that seem to belong only to the pages of the Bible, but miracles that can still happen. Miracles that transform lives, that change stories, that make us see that faith can move the impossible. If Jesus did this more than 2,000 years ago, what can he do in your life today? Maybe you are going through a difficult time. Maybe there is something in your life that seems dead, hopeless, with no way out. A dream that faded, an opportunity that was lost, an answer that never arrived. But what if I told you that the same Jesus who gave life to this young man before Lazarus can still transform any situation, no matter how impossible it may seem? What you're about to hear is more than just ancient history. It is a testimony that Jesus has the power to reverse any situation, to bring light where there is darkness, to give a new beginning when everything seems to have come to an end. This is a story that few know. But today, you're about to find out one of Jesus' most mysterious and impressive miracles. Stay with me until the end, because this revelation could change your view of Jesus' miracles forever. This story has a special purpose and has come to you at the right time. Nothing happens by chance. If you are here now, it is because this message has something powerful to deliver to you. Every detail of this miracle of Jesus brings a teaching that can transform the way we see faith, hope, and even life's challenges. And here in Unknown Stories of Jesus, each content is made for those looking for more than answers, for those who want to feel, live, and experience the power of Jesus' miracles. This is the right place for you. As this story unfolds, pay attention to the details. There is something in this story that can speak directly to your heart. With each scene, with each word of Jesus, something special will be revealed. And in the end, you will understand why this miracle happened and what it can mean for your life today. Now tell me, what was the most memorable moment of Jesus' miracles for you? There are stories that touch the soul in different ways, and this story may surprise you. Write in the comments what comes to your mind when you think about the power of Jesus, because this exchange enriches everything we talk about here. Have you ever felt the touch in your heart that this content is for you? So click the like button. This shows that these stories need to continue to be shared and makes this message reach more people who need to hear about Jesus' miracles. Now, let's go back in time and relive this extraordinary moment. Imagine a small village lost among arid hills where the dry wind raises dust along the dirt roads. The houses, made of rough stones and clay, are simple, with small flat roofs and weathered wooden doors. Here, life follows an almost unchanging rhythm marked by the rising and setting of the sun, hard work in the fields, and the sound of the voices of women who gather to grind grains and prepare bread. The residents of this village are simple but resilient people. Men and young men go out at dawn to cultivate wheat and barley in the nearby fields. Some head to the streams to collect water, while others go fishing in the distant lakes and rivers. Everything they manage to harvest or fish is made the most of, as their livelihood depends on each small harvest. Women spend a good part of the day weaving clothes, preparing food, and teaching children traditions that have passed down generations. The market, although modest, is the village's social center. Once a week, merchants arrive bringing spices, fabrics, and utensils from other lands. Residents gather around the tents where the aromas of dried dates, olive oil, and wine stored in clay jars mix. Conversations and negotiations take place under the shade of large olive trees, as elders discuss the scriptures and recall the teachings of the prophets. The culture of these people is deeply rooted in faith. Each action of the day begins and ends with a prayer, whether asking for provisions for the harvest or giving thanks for the water that reaches the jugs. On Saturdays, the streets are silent and families gather together, dedicating the day to rest and worship, remembering God's promises and the hope of the Messiah. Rabbis are respected figures, as they are the guardians of the law and those who interpret the sacred writings for the people. But despite the unshakable faith, there is a fear that haunts the alleys of this village, the fear of death. Back then, death was more than a physical end. It carried a deep spiritual and emotional weight. Without the advances of modern medicine, any small symptom could be a harbinger of something worse. Fevers that today would be easily treated were fatal sentences. Unknown illnesses were seen as divine punishments, and any tragedy was interpreted as a warning from the heavens. Uncertainty hovered over every home, every family. Older people feared that their children would leave early. Young people feared not having then time to build their own stories. Mothers feared losing their children before they even saw them grow up. It was a silent but ever-present fear. And the worst part was not just losing someone, but what happened after death. There were different beliefs about this. Some believed that the righteous rested awaiting final judgment, while sinners suffered the consequences of their mistakes. Others feared that death was a crossing into an unknown place, from which no one would return to tell what was. On the other side, this fear manifested itself in several ways. There were rituals to ward off bad luck, songs that were sung to protect homes, fasts that sought divine mercy. But deep down, everyone knew that when death knocked on the door, there wasn't much they could do. Grief was a collective experience. When someone left, the whole village mobilized. Women cried loudly in the streets, a common practice to express the pain of loss. Family members tore their clothes in a sign of despair, and friends brought ointments and perfumes to prepare the body for burial. Within a few hours, the person was wrapped in cloths and taken to a tomb excavated in the rock where they would rest forever. But what if there was a way to challenge this cycle? What if, in the midst of this village marked by the fear of death, something extraordinary was about to happen? Elijah. That was the young man's name, a common name in his village, but one that carried an unusual spirit. Ever since he was little, Elias stood out, not because he was stronger or faster than the other kids, but because his presence seemed to light up any room. He had a captivating manner, a curious look, and an easy smile, which made everyone around him feel at ease. He was a devoted son, a loyal friend, and a young man full of dreams. Everyone in the village knew Elias. He was the one who helped his neighbors without anyone having to ask. If a cart broke down on the road, Elijah was there to push it. If an older merchant had difficulty carrying his goods to market, Elijah readily offered his help. If a child cried because he had hurt himself playing on the dirt streets, he was the first to bend down, clean the wound, and say a few words of comfort. His heart was big, and his generosity even greater. Elijah grew up hearing stories of the great prophets and the promises that God made to the people of Israel. While many young people saw the scriptures as something distant, reserved only for rabbis and elders, Elijah wanted to understand every word, every promise, every teaching. He felt there was something beyond the village routine, something bigger waiting for him. His heart burned for something he couldn't explain. He dreamed. I dreamed of traveling to Jerusalem and seeing the majestic temple with my own eyes. He dreamed of walking among the wise, of listening to the words of the great teachers of the law. But at the same time, he loved his village, he loved his family, and he would never abandon them. Without a just reason, there was something inside him that made him believe his life had a greater purpose, but he didn't know what it was. His father was a farmer, a man of few words but much wisdom. He worked hard in the fields since before the sun rose and taught his son that the land requires patience and dedication. Many times, as they planted together, Elijah heard his father say, "The earth teaches us about life. If we sow with faith, we will reap at the right time." Elijah always carried these words in his heart, as he knew they spoke of much more than just harvests. His mother, on the other hand, was the living expression of love. He had a sweet look and a strength that kept the house standing, no matter how difficult the day was. She cared about everyone, but she had a special affection for Elias. He felt that his son was different, that God had placed something special inside him. Many times when Elijah came home late because he was listening to stories from travelers passing through the village, his mother would just smile and say, "One day you will understand why your soul seeks so much." Elijah also had younger brothers who saw him as a hero. Whenever they could, they ran after him, trying to imitate his gestures, his games, his stories. To them, Elijah was more than a brother. He was an example. Someone who seemed to have no fear of anything. But the truth was that Elijah had fears. He was afraid of disappointing those he loved. He was afraid of not finding his true purpose. He was afraid that his life would be just one of many. In the village, Elias was seen as a promising young man. The elders liked him, as they saw in him respect and thirst for knowledge. Merchants appreciated his honesty. His friends admired his courage. For everyone, Elias was a young man full of life, full of future, full of plans. But fate had something unexpected in store for him. Now tell me, have you ever felt like your life has a greater purpose, even without knowing exactly what it is? Comment below, "I feel like God has a purpose for me," if you believe that nothing happens by chance. And keep watching, because this story still has a lot to reveal. Elijah was always strong. Since he was little, he ran through the fields, climbed the hills around the village, and helped his father carry heavy sacks of wheat without showing signs of tiredness. He had the vitality of someone who believed that nothing could stop him, that his life was just beginning, and that the future held something great for him. No one could have imagined that, from one moment to the next, everything would change. The day started like any other. The sun had risen brightly, casting its golden rays over the small stone houses. The market was busy, with traders shouting their offerings, women buying spices, and elders sitting in the shade of an olive tree, debating the scriptures. Elijah, as usual, helped his father in the field. He liked that routine, the feeling of planting something and patiently waiting for it to grow. But that morning, something felt different. As he worked, Elias felt a slight discomfort. First, it was dizziness, a temporary weakness that he ignored. He continued pushing the hoe into the dry earth, convincing himself that it was just the heat of the day. But then came a strange feeling in my chest, as if something was out of place. He put his hand over his heart, took a deep breath, and tried to ignore what he felt. His younger brothers were nearby, laughing, playing, and he didn't want to worry them. Time passed and the feeling got worse. His body began to tremble slightly, his legs lost their firmness, and suddenly everything around him seemed to spin. Before he could react, Elijah fell to his knees in the dirt, breathing heavily. His father, realizing something was wrong, ran to him. "Elijah, what there was?" The young man tried to respond, but his vision became blurred. His head felt heavy, and sweat ran down his forehead. He struggled to stand, but his strength betrayed him. That's when despair took over. His mother came running, his little brothers started crying, and the neighbors approached, trying to understand what was happening. At that time, any illness could be a sign of something serious. People believed that illness was often a divine punishment, a sign that something was wrong. Some murmured that Elijah might be paying for the family's sins, that perhaps God was trying to teach them a lesson. Others, more rational, tried to find a natural explanation. But fear spoke louder. He was taken home where his mother prepared herbs and infusions, trying to make him better. The women of the village came to help, bringing oils and perfumes, praying loudly, calling for a miracle. But Elijah only got worse. His skin grew paler with each passing hour, his breathing became weaker, and the hope that he would recover began to dissipate. The entire village felt the weight of that moment. The once busy streets became silent. People looked at Elias's house with expressions full of sadness. Time seemed to have stopped. When night fell, the silence was broken by a sound that everyone knew well, the loud crying of the women in the house. It was the confirmation that no one wanted to hear. Elijah was dead. The news spread quickly. People came out of their homes, some to show solidarity with the family, others just to watch from afar. Grief at that time was not just a feeling, it was a ritual. Women tore off pieces of their clothes in a sign of desperation. Neighbors brought cloth and perfume to wrap the body. Everything needed to be done quickly, as the heat meant that the dead were buried on the same day. Elijah's mother was inconsolable. His once serene face was now a mask of pain. His father, a strong and silent man, held back tears, but his look said it all. The younger brothers did not fully understand what had happened, but they cried when they saw their mother's suffering. The first light of the morning brought with it the preparation for the burial. Elijah's body was washed, wrapped in white cloths, perfumed with myrrh and aloes. According to tradition, he would be placed in a tomb dug into the rock, where he would remain forever. The rabbis recited psalms, the elders murmured prayers, and the people of the village gathered around watching in silence. Elijah's life, which seemed to have so much to offer, had come to an unexpected end. But something was about to happen, something no one could imagine. The first light of the morning brought with it a heavy silence, an emptiness that seemed to spread through the dusty streets of the village. Elijah's body had already been prepared for burial, wrapped in white fabrics perfumed with myrrh and aloes. His mother remained sitting next to him, looking lost, unable to accept reality. His father, standing by the door, maintained a rigid posture, but his expression carried deep pain. Neighbors murmured among themselves, some shaking their heads in sadness, others trying to console the family. But then something happened. A traveler came running along the main road, his tunic dusty from the long journey. He was breathing heavily, but his voice was firm and clear enough for everyone around him to hear. "Jesus is coming here." The news cut through the air like thunder. For a moment, no one reacted. It was as if those words took a long time to process. Jesus, the rabbi, the master, the man everyone was talking about. Was he coming to that village right now? Conversations quickly intensified. The elders exchanged worried looks. The rabbis furrowed their eyebrows, trying to understand what this meant. The women murmured among themselves, some wiping away tears that were still fresh from grief. The children, who until then had been secluded, began to leave their homes, curious to see what would happen. The news spread faster than anyone could have imagined. The name of Jesus was not strange to anyone. There, Months ago, reports of his miracles circulated throughout the region. They said that he healed the sick with a simple touch, that the blind could see again, that even lepers were restored. But bringing someone back to life? This seemed impossible. The people began to gather on the road leading to the village, eager to see if that was really true. Was he really coming? Would you do something in the face of this tragedy? Elijah's mother heard the murmurs, and for a moment, her heart quickened. She lifted her head, her eyes still red from crying. Part of her wanted to believe there was hope, that something could change. But then his mind was filled with doubt. It was already too late. Elijah had already left. What else could be done? Jesus walked along the road, surrounded by his disciples and some people who had followed him from previous villages. His gaze was serene but firm. His walk was determined, and his presence, even without words, already had a profound impact on whoever saw him. The people moved away a little when he entered the village. It was not fear, but reverence. He was no ordinary man. There was something about him that no one could explain, something that went beyond what the eyes could see. He carried a different authority, a presence that made even the most skeptical people question themselves. Looking around, Jesus saw the distressed faces, the expectant eyes, the hesitant whispers of the crowd. He sensed the suffering, felt the pain in the air, but he didn't rush. His gaze swept over each person there, as if he already knew exactly what was happening before anyone even told him. The house where Elias' body was lying was small, simple like all the others in the village. The stone walls supported a clay roof that creaked slightly in the hot afternoon wind. Inside, the smell of myrrh and aloe filled the room, mixed with the incense burned as a sign of respect for the deceased. The atmosphere was heavy. Grief hung in the air, and the silence was broken only by the muffled sobs of his mother, who remained kneeling beside the body, holding her son's cold hand with a sadness impossible to describe. Elijah's father was standing near the door, his eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't cry, not because I didn't feel pain, but because I simply didn't know how to express it. Ever since he received the news of his son's death, something inside him broke. The man who had always been the stronghold of the house, the provider, the one everyone saw as an example of strength, now felt powerless. He should have protected his son, he should have done something, but he didn't. And now, all he had left was emptiness. The buzz of the crowd outside increased when Jesus entered. Elijah's father slowly raised his head, his tired eyes meeting Jesus's. Elias's mother, noticing the master's presence, felt her heart race. For a brief moment, something inside her reignited, a remnant of hope fighting to survive. But reality soon set in. His son was dead. Nothing more could be done. She got up, staggering from crying, and took a few steps towards Jesus. His eyes were red, his skin marked with grief. His voice, when it finally came out, was shaky, full of pain. If the Lord had arrived earlier, my son would not have died. The sentence hung in the air. Some women inside the house started crying again. The neighbors who had come in to show solidarity bowed their heads, feeling the weight of those words. Elias's father took a deep breath, looking away, as if he also believed those words were true. If Jesus had arrived sooner, perhaps Elijah would be alive now. But Jesus did not respond immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on that woman's eyes, as if she were seeing far beyond what she herself could see. His silence was deeper than any word spoken there, and then, unexpectedly, he smiled. It was a subtle, serene smile, but it made that mother's heart sink. How could he smile at that moment? What did that mean? Despair rose within her. My son has already been prepared for burial. The tomb is ready. It's too late. Elijah's father remained silent, but his eyes carried the same question. He respected Jesus. He had heard about his miracles. He knew he was a man of God. But now that the son was already dead, what could be done? Jesus, however, did not move. His gaze, firm and compassionate, passed from his mother to his father, and then to each person present in that house. He saw the pain, he saw the grief, he saw the uncertainty, but he also saw something beyond that. The silence seemed unbearable. Elijah's mother waited for an answer. Elijah's father wanted to understand why he was there. Neighbors looked at each other, unsure. Jesus had healed so many people, but had he ever brought anyone back to life? And then, finally, Jesus spoke. Where is he? The question was simple, but loaded with meaning. Elijah's father frowned. He didn't understand. Everyone knew where Elijah was. The body was there, right in front of Jesus. So why did he ask this? Elijah's mother blinked, confused. His heart sped up. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The rabbis, who had been called to conduct the funeral rites, looked at each other. One of them, a respected elder in the village, cleared his throat before speaking. "Sir, the body has already been prepared for burial." Jesus just kept his gaze fixed on him, waiting. Elijah's father took a deep breath and finally replied, "It's there." He pointed to the corner of the house where his son's body was lying on a stone surface covered in white fabrics. The smell of fragrant oils and herbs filled the air, a sign that everything was ready for parting. Jesus stepped forward. The murmur of the people around grew. What was he about to do? Elijah's father felt a shiver run up his spine. He wanted to believe. He wanted to have faith, but he couldn't. How could I? Death was definitive. It always was. Elijah's mother began to cry. Again, she wanted to believe something was possible, but her mind screamed no. She then looked into Jesus' eyes and, through tears, repeated almost in a whisper, "If the Lord had arrived earlier, my son would not have died." Jesus took a deep breath and placed his hand on her shoulder. The touch was light, but it carried a weight that was impossible to describe. And then, in a quiet but authoritative voice, he said, "Trust in me." These words hit that mother's heart like a strong gust of wind. His chest rose and fell rapidly. His body shook. Something inside her fought against logic, against reality, against everything that made sense. Elijah's father just watched. His heart was frozen, his mind divided between pain and disbelief. He wanted to understand, but something inside him said that day he wasn't about to understand anything. And then Jesus began to approach Elijah's body. The atmosphere in the house changed completely. The crying stopped. Everyone's breath caught in their throats. The looks, previously full of mourning, were now filled with doubt, fear, and hope. What would happen next? Now tell me, if you were there at that moment, what would you feel? Would you believe something supernatural was about to happen? Or would your mind tell you it was too late? Comment below, "I trust in Jesus," if you believe that the impossible can happen. And keep watching, because what comes next no one ever imagined. The tension in the house was almost palpable. Every gaze was fixed on Jesus, every breath held, as if no one dared to disturb that moment. The crying had stopped, the murmurs had dissipated, and all that was left was a profound silence, a void filled with expectation and fear. Elijah's mother held her hands to her chest, shaking. The father remained rigid, not knowing what to feel. The rabbis stood motionless. The neighbors stood in a state of hesitation and fascination. The air itself seemed thicker, as if something invisible was taking over In place, Jesus took another step. The wood beneath his feet creaked slightly, but no one moved. His expression was serene, but there was an intensity in his gaze, a determination that no one there could understand. And then he stopped before the body of Elijah. The young man was there wrapped in white cloths, his face pale and motionless. The smell of herbs and perfumed oils filled the air, a sign that everything was ready for burial. But Jesus did not look away. He didn't look at Elijah the way others did. He didn't see an end. He didn't see a goodbye. Elijah's mother, unable to bear that silence, swallowed hard and whispered, "What will the Lord do?" Jesus did not respond. He just stood there, watching, as if he was waiting for something. The surrounding crowd tried to contain their anxiety. Some people closed their eyes in prayer, others simply held on, not knowing whether to expect a miracle or just a word of comfort. And then, Jesus stretched out his hand. The movement was slow, but full of purpose. Some people held their breath as they saw him getting even closer to the body. Would he touch Elijah? This was unthinkable. According to Jewish law, touching a dead person would make someone unclean. But Jesus didn't seem to hesitate. He didn't care about human traditions. He didn't care about rules that limited God's power. And suddenly, thunder sounded in the distance. The wooden windows vibrated with the distant sound, and some women let out small screams of fright. The wind blew hard through the open door, making the flames of the lamps dance, casting strange shadows across the stone walls. Everyone's hearts raced. Was it just a coincidence? Or did that mean something? Jesus continued with his hand outstretched, his fingers just inches from Elijah's body. Time seemed to have slowed down. The young man's mother covered her mouth, feeling the tears return to her eyes. The father just watched, unable to move. And then finally, Jesus spoke. His voice was low, but firm. It wasn't a scream, it wasn't a desperate prayer. It was a command. Get up. It was as if each word had passed through space, as if the very air around them had changed. The rabbi's eyes widened. Some of those present instinctively took a step back. Elijah's father held his breath. Nothing happened for a brief moment, and then time seemed to have stopped. Jesus' words still echoed in the air, as if each syllable carried an invisible weight. Get up, simple, direct, but said with an authority that no one there had ever heard before. The silence was absolute. No one dared to move, no one dared even breathe. All eyes were fixed on Elijah's body, waiting, fearing, not knowing what would happen next. And then, a movement. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. At first, no one was sure if they had actually seen it. But when the cloths covering the young man's body moved slightly, the hearts of every person in that place stopped for an instant. Elijah's mother's eyes widened. His body was paralyzed between the desire to believe and the fear that he was imagining things. The father, a man accustomed to facing the weight of life firmly, felt his knees weaken. One of the rabbis muttered something under his breath, but no one paid attention. And then Elijah moved again. This time there was no doubt. The cloths above him rose and fell, as if a breath of life was filling his lungs again. A slight tremor ran through his body. His fingers twitched. His head turned slightly to the side, as if waking up from a deep sleep. It was at that moment that one of the neighbors let out a scream, an involuntary sound of absolute shock. Some women stepped back, putting their hands to their mouths to contain their surprise. Others began to cry, unable to process what they were witnessing. The elders exchanged looks of pure astonishment. And then Elijah's eyes opened. They blinked a few times, adjusting to the dim light from the lamps scattered around the house. But something was different. Those were not the eyes of someone who had simply awakened from a deep sleep. They carried an indescribable radiance, something that no one there could understand. His mother, who was still motionless, felt the tears running down her face again. Was it real? Would it be possible? Elijah's father took a step forward, his breathing quickening. He wanted to say something. He wanted to ask if it was true. He wanted to touch his son to make sure he wasn't dreaming. But the words didn't come out. And then Elijah took a deep breath. It was a light sound, but it filled the entire environment. Air filled his lungs again. His chest rose and fell slowly, as if he was feeling life return to his body. And then the first word. It was a whisper, weak, almost inaudible, but it was enough for his mother to throw herself at him, covering his face with kisses and tears. The people around didn't know what to do. Some began to scream in shock. Others fell to their knees, crying. Some ran. out of the house, unable to remain there in the face of what they considered a supernatural event. But there was something in Elijah's look that made even the most skeptical people stay where they were. Because I had seen something. Now tell me, what do you think Elijah saw while he was dead? Comment below. I want to know what he saw, if you also feel this curiosity. And keep watching, because this story isn't over yet. The impact of what had happened still hung in the air like silent thunder. Elijah was alive. There was no longer any doubt. He breathed, moved, blinked his eyes, still confused, trying to understand where he was. But something in his expression said he wasn't the same. Death touched him, and he saw something that no one there could imagine. Elijah's mother couldn't stop crying. His hands roamed his son's face, feeling his warm skin, his bright eyes, his chest moving with each breath. It was real. The son she had lost was there, before her. His heart was beating hard, between relief and disbelief. She wanted to ask so many things. She wanted to hear his voice. She wanted to understand. But she just cried, unable to say a word. Elijah's father, who until then had tried to maintain his strong stance, did not resist. He fell to his knees in front of his son and held his face with shaking hands. His gaze was that of a man who had been broken by pain and was now faced with the impossible. Logic said that this was not possible, but there before his eyes was living proof that the impossible had happened. The people inside the house were stunned. Some still looked at Elijah as if he were a spirit, a specter, without knowing how to react. Others simply cried, unable to contain their emotions. Outside, the crowd grew. The buzz spread quickly. People who had not witnessed the miracle ran to the house to understand what was happening. Everyone wanted to see it with their own eyes. Elias, however, did not react immediately. He breathed, blinked, moved his fingers, but said nothing. His mind seemed to wander between two worlds. Where has he been? What did he see? His eyes roamed the room. The fire from the lamps flickered on the walls, casting strange shadows. He saw the familiar faces around him, felt his mother's touch, the strength of his father's hands. But there was something inside him, something deep that he was still trying to understand. Jesus remained silent. He watched Elijah with a serene gaze, as if he knew exactly what was happening inside him. He didn't ask anything, just waited, until finally Elijah opened his mouth. I saw. His voice was weak, hoarse, as if it were the first time he had spoken in a long time. But those two words were enough to make everyone's hearts race. His mother sobbed, squeezing his hands even tighter. The father held his breath. The rabbis looked at each other, worried. What did you see, my son? The mother whispered, as if afraid of the answer. Elijah took a deep breath. His eyes were different. There was something about them, something no one could describe. He looked at his father, at his mother, at the people around him. His mind was full of images he couldn't explain, memories that didn't belong to the world of the living. The silence was deafening. Everyone waited for his answer. I saw the light. It was just that. But it was enough to make some people cry even harder. The rabbis were worried. What did this mean? What did he mean? Elijah looked at Jesus, his eyes filled with tears. I didn't want to go back. Those words fell on everyone like an invisible weight. What did that mean? What did he experience? What was on the other side? His mother put her hands to her face, crying without understanding. The father closed his eyes, trying to process those words. Some people took steps back, fearing what they were hearing. Death has always been a mystery, and now someone who had been there, in front of the unknown, was there, in front of them, saying that I didn't want to go back. Jesus remained silent. He knew what Elijah had seen. He knew what was in the young man's heart, but he also knew that his mission on earth was not yet over. And then Elijah took a deep breath again and said, I was called back, but I don't understand why. Silence still dominated the environment. Elijah's words echoed in the minds of everyone present. I was called back, but I don't understand. Why? The weight of this sentence seemed to carry a mystery that no one could understand. What did it mean to have crossed the border between life and death? What had he experienced? And more importantly, why did Jesus bring him back? The young man's eyes were filled with an emotion that was difficult to describe. He was faced with something that could not be explained with human words. His breathing was deep, as if he was trying to find a way to express what he felt. But how to explain the inexplicable? Elias' mother still held his hand tightly, not daring to let go. The father was motionless, absorbing every detail of the scene, trying to understand what had just happened. The rabbis, who until then had maintained a firm stance, now seemed uneasy. This miracle was beyond what they could rationalize. It wasn't just a cure. It was a challenge to the very nature of existence. It was then that Jesus, who had remained silent until that moment, finally spoke. His voice was calm, but carried with an authority that made everyone hold their breath. Blessed are those who believe without seeing. The sentence cut through the silence like a sharp blade. The words were simple, but they carried immeasurable spiritual weight. Jesus looked directly at Elijah, who was still trying to understand why he had returned. He knew what was in the young man's heart. She knew what he felt, the questions that fought inside his mind. And then, with a calm but firm tone, he said, "You didn't come back by chance." Elijah looked at him, still with tears in his eyes. His voice was choked when he asked, "But why? What does this mean?" Jesus got a little closer, letting his words fill every corner of that house, every heart present there. Life does not end with death, but not everyone is ready for what comes next. That answer caused some rabbis to exchange nervous glances. Some women began to cry again, this time not out of sadness, but because they felt something deep inside them. Jesus continued, "You fear death because you don't understand it. But death is not an end, but a passage. The Father has plans for each of you, and as long as there is purpose, life goes on." Elias lowered his head, reflecting. He had been called back, but that meant that his mission was not yet over. Jesus then looked at those present and said something that would mark that moment forever. "If you believe, you will see the glory of God." His words were like fire inside the hearts of everyone there. Faith was not just believing when everything was fine. Faith was trusting. Even when there was no explanation, Elijah's mother fell to her knees, her hands covering her face, crying with emotion. The father, who until then had been holding back his tears, finally allowed himself to feel. His son was alive. The crowd outside the house murmured among themselves. Some were still trying to understand. Others were just crying, touched by what they had witnessed. But one thing was certain, no one would leave there the same way. Now tell me, do you believe that faith can change everything? Comment below. I believe in the glory of God. If you believe that miracles still happen. And keep watching, because this story has even more powerful revelations. The impact of that miracle was still etched in the eyes and hearts of everyone who witnessed it. Elijah was alive. Death had been reversed before them, defying everything they knew about existence. But Jesus wanted them to understand something much bigger than the simple fact that Elijah came back to life. This miracle wasn't just about him. It was about faith. It was about seeing beyond what the eyes could see. What did this mean to those people? For that simple village, used to seeing death as a final destination, where the fear of loss was part of everyday life, Jesus had shown that life did not end in death, that there was something greater, something eternal. But was everyone there ready to believe that? Some were still shaking. Others were murmuring among themselves, trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. The rabbis, accustomed to studying the scriptures and teaching about God, were now faced with something that no study could explain. If Jesus had power over death itself, who was he really? Elijah's mother looked at her son with a mixture of joy and reverence. His heart was overflowing with gratitude, but also with a new understanding. That day had changed his life forever. Your son didn't just come back from the dead, he came back with a purpose. And then the question arises, and us, what does this story mean for each of us today? How often do we see situations as if they were an end point? How many times do we believe that something is lost, without a solution, without hope? Just as that family cried without imagining that a miracle was about to happen, how many times do we despair before seeing what God can do? This miracle teaches us that we don't always understand God's plans, but we can trust Him. He sees beyond what we can see. While we think this is the end, He may be preparing a new beginning. But to see the glory of God, you must believe. Maybe you are going through something that seems impossible. Perhaps you are facing a moment of uncertainty, of pain, of loss. But this story reminds us that Jesus continues to perform miracles. The difference is in those who choose to believe, even when everything seems lost. Elijah's story was not just an isolated miracle, it was a demonstration of Jesus' absolute power over life and death, proof that faith can transform even the impossible. That village would never be the same again. Each person who witnessed that moment would leave with a new vision about life, about death, about God. But the real question is not what happened there. The real question is, what does this story mean to you? How many times have you felt stuck? How many times have you looked at a situation and thought, this is already dead, there is no hope? How many times have you cried over something you thought would never be restored again? This story teaches us that with Jesus, the end is never really the end. The impossible can become possible when we put our faith in Him. The difference between those who saw this miracle and those who experience miracles today is not the presence of Jesus, because He is still here. The difference is in those who choose to believe. And now I ask you, do you believe miracles still happen? Do you believe that God can restore what seemed lost? I'm sure this story touched your heart. Then leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Because here in Unknown Stories of Jesus, we are just beginning to reveal the miracles that many have never heard of. What if I told you that is there another miracle of Jesus that almost no one knows about? You won't want to miss the next video. Turn on notifications and comment below, I want more stories, so that this message continues to reach more people. See you in the next episode. May God bless you. The Hidden Stories of Jesus.